All right. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask before I begin my lecture for today? So let me begin by making a brief announcement, namely that there is a novel that has been assigned to you for this class. It's a novel by E.M. Forster. I've mentioned it in passing before, and I hope you'll take the Thanksgiving break to try to read the novel. Don't look at it as a chore, because it's a marvelous novel. It's one of the great novels of the 20th century, and it will give you, I think, quite extraordinary insights into what's happening in India in the, let's say, circa 1900, early 1900s, moving into the 1920s, 30s. It's obviously, you shouldn't be viewing it as a work of history, but what it does is it gives you a psychological portrait, among other things, of the English in India and their relations with the British, and how things such as race and gender entered into the understanding that people had of what the British were doing in India. So, and gives you some insights into such British institutions as the club. For those of you who have already started reading the novel, you'll know that a good portion of the novel takes place in discussions, having discussions between amongst the English in the club. So do read it, and I will spend about 10-15 minutes in my opening lecture on Tuesday, next Tuesday, talking about E.M. Forster's passage to India. Now, the point at which I had terminated my previous lecture was I was discussing to you the politics of a man by the name of Bal Gangadhar Tilak, whose name I've written once again, and I recall what I mentioned to you, that he is an Indian nationalist who is going to, in some ways, mark a break with previous strands of nationalism, because he's going to be principally responsible for introducing what you might call the notion of the masses into Indian politics, right? So that's the point at which I had actually stopped my lecture last week, and what I want to now suggest to you is that there are very particular ways in which one can attempt to assess his impact on Indian politics, and two of the things that he's most well known for is number one, his revival of what is called the Ganpati festival. It's also known as a Ganesh festival, but it's usually referred to as a Ganpati festival. Ganpati is the elephant-headed god that you might have seen, one of the great iconic images of popular Hinduism. And in the Ganpati festival, which is celebrated with great fanfare in Western India, particularly down to the present day. I mean, if you go to let's say Bombay or Pune during the Ganpati festival, it's a mass of people, and what they do is they have images of the god, which and these images could be pocket-sized images, and they could be gigantic images, 10, 15, 20 feet in height, and then they take them to the sea, and they immerse them in a body of water. If you're nowhere close to a sea, but you're close to a lake or a pond, you would immerse the image in that body of water. All right. So Ganesh is one of the most beloved of the Indian gods. He is the remover of obstacles, among other things. And so what Tilak does is that he revives this Ganpati festival and politicizes it. That's the key feature here. So it's an occasion to bring together the masses. Now remember that we're talking circa 1900. Okay, nationalism is slowly in the air. Recall that the Indian National Congress has been founded in 1885, but at this point it's a largely ineffective organization. Its membership has grown, albeit grown very slowly. I mean, at this point you're talking about a few thousand members. And just to furnish a contrast right at the outset, when we speak of Congress as a mass organization, you have to think about 1920, 1921, when under the leadership of Mohandas Gandhi, it's going to have over 1.5 million paid subscribers. Okay, And at that point, it's going to be the largest mass organization of its kind anywhere in the world, in fact. But that's not what the Congress is in 1900. Right? So what Tilak is attempting to do now is he's attempting to revive, okay, this Ganpati festival, but give it a political tinge, give it a political coloring. Right? So when you have the masses, one of the things you can do is you can circulate handbills, you can circulate posters, right? And what he's encouraging people to do is to obviously think about what it means for Indians to be under British rule. Recall his slogan, right? Swaraj is my birthright. That's the particular slogan I mentioned to you in my concluding remarks. That is freedom, self-rule, right, is my birthright. And Tilak is eminently successful because he's a great orator as well. He's a great writer. Like many of the major Indian nationalists, such as Gandhi later on, he has a newspaper, which is his own newspaper, called the Kesari. And in fact, he uses that as his political vehicle, right, for expressing his idea. So we're already now well into something which I had described to you before, namely that public sphere, right? A public sphere where oratory, public discussion, print journalism, all of this has in fact actually become really quite critical. He's also going to revive the figure of Shivaji. Now many of you may not recall at this juncture, because it's now 9 weeks since we had started this class, but in the opening lectures, perhaps I think in the second or third lecture, I had spoken to you very briefly about Shivaji, because he's the person who initiated this idea of what you might call guerrilla warfare in India. So this is during the time of the Mughals, when the Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb, after the death of Aurangzeb, is going to begin to go into a decline. And Shivaji is the leader of the Marathas, right? So recall the Marathas have been mentioned periodically in the first few weeks, because this is a substantial fighting force, and it's not until 1818 that the Marathas were in fact actually eliminated by the British, right? So the Marathas had been a major force. Shivaji is the person who had made possible the political entry of the Marathas. What Tilak is going to do is he's going to revive the figure of Shivaji. So he's going to use the platform of the Ganpati festival to do that. Right? So this is, in short, the importance of Tilak, somebody who, as I said, is going to bring in the notion of the masses into Indian politics, not, of course, as eminently as Gandhi is going to do so. I mean, we're still well short of really what we might call as a pan-Indian mass politics. So the mass politics that you have at this point is still confined largely to the state of Maharashtra on the one hand, and then, as we're going to see shortly, on the other hand, at the eastern end of the country in Bengal. All right. Now, Tilak is going to be put on trial on two different occasions. One is going to be in 1897. The other one is going to be in 1908. And both of the times he's going to be put on trial on charges of sedition. His second trial, which is in 1908, is going to lead to a conviction and exile to Mandalay. Mandalay is in Burma. So he's going to be more or less removed from the Indian political scene for a substantial number of years. Now that's important because, as we are going to see subsequently, it's going to pave the way for Gandhi in some respects. Right? But what my reason for mentioning the trials of Tilak is to reinforce an idea which I think is actually quite central, and which I had highlighted to you in passing on a previous occasion, namely the fact that people like Tilak are exceedingly good in being able to command the space of the courtroom. The space of the courtroom. So what do I mean? What I mean by that, very briefly, is this. I mean, if you look at Indian nationalism, okay, and let's say we go back to 1858. I don't want to describe Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last of the Mughal emperors, as an Indian nationalist, right? But nonetheless, later Indian nationalists are going to suggest that that's one way we should view him, right, as a leader of the rebellion. And you recall what happened to Bahadur Shah Zafar, that when the British troops recapture Delhi in late 1857, they're going to put him on trial. right? And so the trial is going to run through the early part of 1858, and then eventually Bahadur Shah Zafar is going to be convicted on charges of sedition, and he also is going to be exiled to Burma. Now, so if you go back to 1858 and you go all the way till 1947, many of the pivotal moments are marked by political trials, right? So, and of course you could ask yourself, why are the British staging these political trials? I mean, if you catch an Indian nationalist, you catch somebody who's a seditionist, right? Why not just shoot the man? Why not just take him into a jungle and shoot him dead and get it over and done with, right? But of course, one of the important elements of British rule is the whole rhetoric of law and order, right? And sometimes, to make the rhetoric stick, you have to subscribe to notions of law and order. That is, there is a rule of law. This is not the rule of the jungle, right? That you have an Indian nationalist, and he's a seditionist. He's writing articles where he's preaching disaffection, where he's telling Indians, you must mutiny, you must rebel against the British. That's what it means to be a seditionist. Right? So obviously you have to pay the price. But the British think that, look, what we're going to do is we're going to put him on trial. Now, of course, in all of these trials, it's a foregone conclusion. The man is going to be convicted. You know that in advance. But nonetheless, the whole exercise is exceedingly important, because what the British are going to do is they're going to say, we're going to present evidence. We're going to present evidence to show that he's a traitor, that he's disloyal, right? And we're going to show that there is due process of law under our rule. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Indians, and we're speaking here about elite Indians, people like Tilak. Who is Tilak? He's a lawyer. Gandhi is a lawyer. Nehru is a lawyer. All of these people have been trained in the law. We haven't yet encountered what Gandhi and Nehru and many others are going to do in the courtroom, because we haven't gotten to that stage yet, right? But there's no question that all of these people have been trained in the law. They're well versed with the procedures of the courtroom, right? And what they're going to do is they're going to go into the courtroom and they are going to be able to master that space, right? And this is, I think, what makes this period extraordinarily interesting, and what makes the lives of these nationalists particularly interesting as well, is that they have mastered the English idioms of law. They know how to actually turn the courtroom to their advantage, right? And if you look at Tilak's trial in 1908, it's a spectacular demonstration of that, because he's going to tear apart the prosecution. I mean, he's going to question them, because they're going to say, you've written such and such article, and this is a seditious article. So Tilak is going to say, let's look at each word of this article. What do you understand by such and such word? And he's going to be able to show that he has a greater command, not only over Sanskrit and over Indian tradition, but he's going to be able to show that he has a greater command over English law than do the English. Right? And he's going to show how there is precedence in English law for many of the things that he has done, right? So the political trial as a avenue for certain negotiations between the Indians and the English is something that I think we ought to take quite seriously. And this is certainly one way in which one could study this period, among hundreds of other ways, right? So long and short of it now, as far as our political narrative is concerned, that is 1908, Tilak is going to be convicted. He's going to be sent off to Mandalay, and he's going to serve a 7-year sentence over there. Now, in eastern India, all right, so this is, Tilak, as I said, is active in the western part of the country, in Bombay and the state of Maharashtra. In eastern India, over here in Calcutta and the neighboring area over there, in 1905, what you're going to have is a movement called the Swadeshi movement. Again, something I've mentioned to you in passing. What is the occasion for this movement, and what is this movement really about, very briefly? So the viceroy at this point in time is Curzon, Lord Curzon. Right? Curzon is an English, a person of English aristocratic background. Virtually all of these people, by the way, I mean, I won't get into details over here, virtually all of them are graduates of Oxford or Cambridge. Okay? Nearly all of the English elite are graduates of these two institutions. right? And each of these two institutions has a particular relationship to the empire, which is a subject unto itself. Now, Curzon, it comes from a similar background, and just to give you an idea, when I say similar background, what it means is that before you go to Oxford or Cambridge, it means that you go to English grammar school. You go to what is called a really good public school. Public in Britain, for those of you who know, means private. When you say public school, it means a private school. So they go to a good public school, a grammar school, and very often it could be a boarding school, right? And then you'll go to Oxford or Cambridge, and for those of them who are going to serve in India, you're going to come to India relatively young. If you're the viceroy, you won't be that young. You may be in your 30s, mid-30s, late 30s perhaps. Now Curzon comes to India. He is quite arrogant, full of himself, and a person who is accustomed to thinking of himself as somebody who has a vast sweep of knowledge over, numerous subjects. Okay, and certainly if you think back to these administrators that I've spoken to you about before, people like Elphinstone, Monroe, Malcolm, right? You've read Malcolm. Remember, many of these people, as I've mentioned, in fact, wrote vociferously. Right? I mean, so they're governing a whole province, and yet they have time to write a 3-volume history of this or that. And you could say that Curzon is of a similar mentality. One of the books he's going to write is this huge work called The Government of India, right? Which is basically an explanation of how the government actually works in India, what are the protocols, what is the relationship between the government in India and the government back in Britain itself. Curzon also has an interest in Indian culture. One of the things that's going to happen under his reign, if I may call it that, is the founding of the Archaeological Survey of India. Right? The Archaeological Survey of India, and Curzon, of course, is of the view that Indians are not interested in protecting their monuments, but he has a moral obligation to ensure that the great glorious monuments from Indian past are going to be preserved. Now, in 1905, Curzon is going to take a decision, and that decision is he's going to partition the province of Bengal. And as you know, Bengal included large parts of Bihar, today modern-day Orissa, further north and east, Assam, and so on. And essentially, this partition is going to take place along what you might describe as communal lines. Okay, so we're going to have to get to the subject of communalism, but before I do that, I want to just show you a couple of images, including a map of India, which is interestingly entitled "Prevailing Religions of India." Okay, so this is a map released by the British in 1909, and as I said, it's called Prevailing Religions. So let me just show you that map, and we'll get to the subject of communalism, and then go back to the partition. Okay, so let me just here one moment. So this, incidentally, is a postage stamp released by the government of India. The figure that you see on the top right and that little box, that's Bal Gangadhar Tilak. And over there it says, Swaraj Mera Janam Siddh Adhikar Hai. Swaraj, that is self-rule, freedom, is in fact my birthright. And then you can see that translation down at the bottom. Bharat is the official name, by the way, in India for the country, not Hindustan or anything of that kind. Typically postage stamps would have both the name Bharat and then in English India. Okay, so this is just meant to, of course, indicate to you the extent to which, as I said, slogans like this became part not simply of the political culture of that time, but still continue to resonate in modern day India. All right. So here is a map of political divisions of the Indian Empire, and what you are seeing here is the division of India into British India and princely India. Right. So even at the height of British rule, there are large parts of the country which are not officially part of British India. I have explained the circumstances of that to you before, that there are all of these native states. And so if you look at the portions marked in yellow, right, those are all the princely states. And when it says Rajputana agencies there, on the left over there, that doesn't mean that that's one native state. You're talking about dozens of native states over there, which are together part of what is called the Rajputana agency. Then you've got the United Provinces here. And the reason this map at this juncture is important is look here on the east. So you see eastern Bengal and Assam right over there, right? Eastern Bengal and Assam. So this is after the partition of 1905. There was no eastern Bengal as a province before that, but you do now see it here on this map. And then to the left of that, you see in big bold letters, Bengal. All right? And what's going to happen, as we'll see, is that this partition is going to be revoked very soon thereafter. And here is a map which is really quite an extraordinary map, because one way in which you want to reinforce the idea of religion is to, in fact, bring out a map of this kind. Right? So this would be a little bit like, let's imagine you did a map of the United States today called Prevailing Religions of America. Okay? You know, I suppose that, of course, you could demarcate it into Christian, Buddhist. I don't know how you would draw up the Buddhist portion because there are just too few of them and they're scattered all over. What about the Muslims? Jews, so I suppose you could say, okay, well, Brooklyn. All right, so, you know, very small portion of the map of the U.S., Brooklyn, let's say, portions of L.A., and you would mark them as Jewish. Right? It would be something like that. You have to ask yourself, why is this map being produced? Is it simply being produced to inform Indians? Is it being used to inform British policy makers? Right? The reason I'm asking this question is because we have to also ask ourselves whether, in fact, doing something like this reinforces this idea, okay, that India is to be viewed principally in religious terms. Right? And that's eventually, of course, going to lead me shortly now to the subject of communalism. But if you look at this note to coloring, so you see the index there, okay, and you see that this large swath of sort of a shade of pink, this is supposed to represent the Hindus. And of course, the problem here is precisely this, that what they're doing is they're saying that that's the predominant religion in all of this part of India here. But if you're looking at the city of Hyderabad, Hyderabad was a predominantly Muslim city, okay? Predominantly Muslim city, right? If you look at Lucknow, right? And this problem is pressing because when we get to the partition in the last lecture of 1947, the partition is based on the idea of the two-nation theory, that the Hindus constitute one nation, the Muslims constitute another nation. But the problem, of course, was that they were dispersed throughout the country. The Muslims. Now, yes, it is true that there are certain areas that had a Muslim majority, okay, or largely a Muslim majority, because then again, within those areas, you might find that there were a large number of people who were not Muslims. In fact, the majority were not Muslims. If you go to the city of Karachi in Sindh, there, so if you look at the green portion over there, and here's the city of Karachi over there, it's a large Sindhi population which was non-Muslim. Okay. Now, of course, it's a different story in 2013 because the Hindu population of Pakistan has been almost entirely eviscerated. I mean, less 1% of the population of Pakistan is Hindu today, right? But in undivided India, the Muslims constituted 1/4 of the entire population of the country, and they are scattered throughout the country. Okay. But this religious map reinforces this idea, right, that in fact you can think of India as large religious blocks. And the yellow here is supposed to indicate Buddhist. The gray here is supposed to indicate Christians. Okay, these are, you might wonder what these are tribal areas, largely Bastar, for example, Chota Nagpur, largely tribal areas. So that's why the Christian population there is more extensive. Okay, and then you have a map of the Indian Railways of 1909. Now, just for the sake of convenience, I'm going to show you a few other images which have nothing to do with what I've been talking about, but this way I can shut down the computer. So I want to mention it right now before I go back to the subject of the partition and communalism. And that is that, as you know, in 1914, there is a World War I, right? And India is going to play a significant role in that, right? There have been books that have been written on this, but to my mind, nothing that really enables us to understand the sheer anomaly of what is happening over here, right? Why are Indians taking part in the war? And when I say taking part in the war, because you know, all you have to do is, of course, simply reflect on the fact that India itself is a subjugated country. It's under colonial rule, right? And World War I, much like World War II, the slogans were a little bit different, but largely one can say that World War I and World War II are both wars that are fought ostensibly on the grounds of procuring freedom, okay? Right? Liberating people from the oppression of, in the case of World War II, from the Nazis and the fascists in Italy and Japan, but principally the Nazis, right? And World War I, the whole argument that Wilson gave, for example, was self-determination. Well, it's not as if at the end of World War I in 1918, all of the colonized countries are going to be liberated. Not even remotely. Nothing like that is going to happen, right? So if India itself is a subjugated domain, India is under colonial rule, what are 1.2 million Indians doing fighting in the war? 1.2 million Indians fought in World War I on behalf of the British Empire. And close to 70,000 died in that enterprise. That's an astronomical number, right? Why are they fighting in Egypt? Okay, so just to give you a sense of where all they're fighting in Egypt. Some of you might have heard of Gallipoli. There's a couple of famous films that have been made. Okay, some of them are fighting in Mesopotamia, i.e. Iraq. All right, so you know the story of proxy wars, if I may put it this way, in Iraq has continued all the way down into the late 20th century, early 21st century, as we can see. Right, somebody else is doing the fighting, you know, over there. Right, they're fighting in Mesopotamia. They're fighting in North Africa. They're fighting in Flanders, in the Low Countries, Belgium, in France, at the Battle of Somme, right? 70,000 of them. And it's only very recently that people have really started looking at what the role of Indians was, you know, in basically shoring up the British Empire, because of course, India is a subjugated country. So when Britain goes to war against Germany, automatically all the colonies, British colonies, are at war with Germany, right? And of course, the British had to have a recruitment effort, you know, in order to be able to send troops. India contributed not just troops, but contributed material goods to the war effort. And India's debt at the end of the war was enormous because of the consequences of the war, right? So what I want to just show you very quickly here are some images. This is a 2nd Cavalry Division. This is in Flanders, and here you have Indian troops laying out barbed wire in a desert in North Africa. Very quickly, as I said, just a few images. Indian bicycle troops at the Battle of Somme. Okay, so this is 1917. Indian gunners in Flanders. Okay, and here you have what is called Hodson's Horse. So this is one of the most distinguished regiments of the Indian Army. Long history, but this is Hodson's Horse. And I can't recall exactly where this was. It might have been in France, but also this would have been around 1917. All right? So now let me get back to the subject of the partition. Right, so I've shown you that map there, the partition of Bengal, not the partition of India, the partition of Bengal in 1905, Curzon. And how was this partition effected? Essentially, what the British did was they argued that this was too large and unwieldy a province, that more effective administration would come about as a consequence of the partition. However, when the partition of Bengal took place, Eastern Bengal and Assam, which becomes one province, and then you have Western Bengal, which is simply called Bengal, which includes portions of Orissa, Bihar. This partition is largely along communal lines. In other words, Eastern Bengal and Assam is going to be a predominantly Muslim province, okay? And Bengal, or Western Bengal, would be a predominantly Hindu province, okay? Now, to realize the consequences of that, to consider the implications of that, all right, we need to step back and talk very briefly about communalism, right? It's a subject that has been broached in this class on previous occasions, but now we need to do a bit more of a systematic inquiry into the question of communalism. So communalism is an ideology. It's an ideology according to which, if you look at the Indian past is to be understood in largely, predominantly religious terms. Okay? And if we went through the ideology of communalism systematically, we would have to begin with such things as identity. Because one of the fundamental presuppositions is that if you look at India, the notion of religious identity predominates over other kinds of identity. Right? And you can speak of collective identities and you can speak of individual identities. So if somebody asked a particular individual who or she is, that person might describe themselves as, for example, as an American or as an Indian, right? Or maybe they might describe themselves as in hyphenated terms. So let's say the Indians in the United States might describe themselves as Indian Americans, right? So one grounds of that identity is the nation state to which you belong. And the nation and the state in turn can be bifurcated. So for example, when you say Indian American, the state of which you are a citizen is the United States, right? But an Indian American might still feel certain notions of cultural affinity to India, for example. They may or may not. It's not necessarily the case that they will. If they'd been, for example, living in the US for 150 years, as Indians have been, for example, in places such as Fiji and Trinidad and so forth, where many of them got completely disconnected from India altogether, right? So there might be very different kinds of scenarios where you may or may not feel certain kinds of notions of cultural affinity. But let's assume that you do. So here are two forms of your identity when we speak of the affiliation that you feel to a place which is cultural and spiritual, right? And raises memories of your ancestors, so forth and so on. And then there is the state, right? But then there are other forms of identity, most of which we assume are given to us. And principally among them would be something like gender, that you're either male or female, right? And then there might be the question of religion, right? So how you identify yourself, as a Hindu or as a Christian, and within Christianity, whether you identify yourself as a Baptist or a Catholic, so forth and so on. Right? And then, of course, in modern times, we have become accustomed to the idea of sexual orientation, which is a bit different. How do you view your sexual orientation? That might be an important constitutive part of your identity. Now, which of these identities is important to you will vary from one situation to another, right? It's because what I'm trying to suggest to you is that identity here is something that is not stable. Right? So very often the example that I give is that imagine that you were locked up in a room with 10 people, right? And the person who's locked up is, let's say, myself, okay? And I happen to be locked up with 10 NBA stars. Now the average height of an NBA star is probably, I'm just going to make a guess, let's say 6 feet 6 inches. Let's say on the average, okay? Right? And so the first thing I might think to myself when I'm locked up in a room with 10 NBA stars is not that I'm Indian, right? Or that I'm gay or straight, right? But the fact that I'm short and these guys are just towering over me, right? That would be the first element that I would really be thinking about, right? On the other hand, if you lock me up in a 10 room and all of these 10 people were attractive young women, then I might not be thinking about this or that. I might be just thinking about the fact that, hey, I'm the only male in this room and there are 10 women in here, okay? And I might be thinking about all the possibilities, right? So now something else in my identity has become a bit more important. On the other, and let's take a third scenario where I get locked up in a room and all of these 10 people happen to be hardcore Republicans and members of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and here I am, somebody who's been teaching Gandhi for 20 years, right? Now I'm going to be thinking about something entirely different with respect to my identity. I might be thinking, how the hell did I get locked up in this room with these 10 people? You know, was I on a suicide mission? You know, right? Right? So you see, identity is not stable. The assumption that identity is stable is something that we need to seriously question. And we should also seriously question the notion that collective identities are stable. Why one should assume that a Hindu will always run towards another Hindu and say, you know, hey, fellow feeling, you know, we are all Hindus, so let's celebrate this fact. Or a Muslim will the minute he sees another Muslim, you know, amongst a crowd of 20 people will say, let me run over to him because now I feel at home, right? No, why should one assume that? Well, the British assume when they're in India that religion is the primordial element of an Indian's identity. That's the first step. The primordial element of an Indian's identity. Secondly, that like gravitates towards like, so to speak. The Hindus will gravitate towards Hindus, the Muslims will gravitate towards Muslims. And you might say, what other option is there? Is there some other way of thinking about it? Yes, there is. A very simple way of thinking about it, right? And this, just by way of a very simple illustration, if you happen to be, okay, a Hindu and you are a working class, member of the working class, all right? You're a carpenter or a potter, okay? And there happens to be another Muslim who happens to be a carpenter and a potter. But that person is a Muslim now, right? So here's a Hindu who's a carpenter or a potter, and then a Muslim who's a member of the working class. And then there is a third person, right, who happens to be an upper caste Hindu, a Brahmin intellectual, let's say. Let's go with the stereotypes here, okay? Why should one assume that the Hindu will feel a greater affinity to the Hindu, working class Hindu will feel an affinity to the Brahmin? The British argument would be that will always be the case because even though they come from vastly different class backgrounds, religion is going to triumph over what? Class. Right? Yeah, that's, as I said, a very simple illustration. Right? Whereas in fact, of course, you might think to yourself, well, two working class people are going to forge a solidarity with each other. Right? Because class can be the basis for a certain kind of solidarity. Right? So the communal view then is that religion is a primordial element of your identity in India. Okay? Second primordial element, by the way, will be caste. So when you get to Hindus, certainly then caste will become all important. They're Hindu, and then caste will be the next element of their identity. Right? And the second step of the argument is that in India, Hindus will gravitate towards Hindus. This is Muslims towards Muslims, Sikhs towards Sikhs, Christians towards Christians, and so on and so forth. This is how you come up with a collective identity. The entire Indian past is now to be understood in these religious terms. In these religious terms. All right? This is the building block of communalism. Now, of course, you might say, well, all right, so what are the consequences? Well, the consequences of that are, in turn, the British are going to take the view that if you look at the Indian past, the adherents of Hinduism and the adherents of Islam, they are unable to get along with each other at all. Right? And there is nothing in history to suggest that they can get along with each other. So the British are going to view this past as not simply a past which is dictated by notions of religious identity, but they're going to essentially suggest that the Indian past is a past of religious conflict. That Islam and Hinduism are two religions mutually incomprehensible to adherents of these religions. One is an Abrahamic faith, the other is a non-Abrahamic faith. One is monotheistic, the other is polytheistic. Right? Whether they are or not is not what we're interested in deciding at the moment. Right? What we're saying is that this is how the British, in fact, are going to construct this Indian past. And what they're going to do is they're going to push back this history of religious conflict as far as they can go, right, when they begin to look at the Indian past. And of course, there are serious ways of objecting to such a characterization, right? Beginning with the observation that, well, did all Hindus think of themselves as Hindus? Right? When did the idea of this corporate identity that you have called being a Hindu come into existence? Now, we know that there were people called Vaishnavas and Shaivites and Shaktos and Tantrics and so forth and so on, right? But did they ever really think of themselves as Hindu? Okay? And similarly with Muslims, right? When did this idea of a monolithic Muslim identity become so important? Was it really important in the Indian past at all, or is this largely a British construction? And the article that you're reading for this course, the article by Gyan Pandey, is an extraordinary demonstration of how, in fact, under the British, a certain kind of discourse of communalism is going to become codified. How it's going to come into place, how it's going to become a rigid discourse by means of which the entire Indian past is going to be explained. And one of the things he shows in this piece, okay, one of the things he shows quite conclusively is how the British develop a certain discourse based on, for example, this idea of the communal riot, the communal conflict. Okay? And if for those of you who read the piece, you would know that what he suggests is that time and space are categories that the British are going to exploit enormously, right, in constructing this discourse. So a riot that takes place in the city of Banaras, let's say in 1809, 100 years later, it might be written up as though this riot could have taken place anywhere in India. That this riot is not simply a riot about Banaras, it shows you the essential features of Indian society. Right? So this is what communalism is about. Okay? And what often people do, and in fact I would go so far as to argue that it is now a genuine problem, so to speak. Okay? That is to say, it is a real problem in Indian society today, because many Indians themselves have accepted the communalist reading of their own past. Right? So to accept the communal reading of their own past, you go back to some of the illustrations that I gave in the early part of the lecture. And the most dramatic instance of that, perhaps not the best, because some people might say, well, he really was a, quote, a Muslim fanatic, but I want to take that particular example. And that is, let's say, the Muslim conqueror, Muhammad of Ghazni. Right? So Muhammad of Ghazni, what does he do? He comes into India on 20 different occasions, right? From 970s AD till about 1010, roughly, okay? Period of 30-35 years, he comes to India. And middle-class Hindus will always tell you that one of the things that Muhammad of Ghazni did was he destroyed the temple of Somnath. Now, it's a Hindu temple. So from their point of view, this shows that Muhammad of Ghazni was acting as a Muslim conqueror who had a hatred for the Hindus. He destroyed their idols, their images. Okay? But the question here is, are we reading this episode 1,000 years later or 500 years later? Are we reading it from the communalist standpoint? Because Muhammad of Ghazni did, in fact, what every conqueror would do. Right? And so when I put it in very colloquial terms, the colloquial terms are, well, had there been a Bank of America or Citibank, that's where he would have gone first, because that's where the wealth is hoarded. The Hindu temple is where the wealth is hoarded. That's what the conqueror is going to do. And yes, he's going to destroy images. He's anti-idolatrous. But the fact of the matter is that he dealt brutally with all those who came in his way, whether they were Hindus or Muslims or anybody else. And there is incontrovertible evidence to suggest that. Right? So the communalist reading, what it will do is it will look at all of these phenomena in predominantly terms of religious conflict. Okay? Between Hindus and Muslims. It could be Muslims and Sikhs, but principally the British were interested in Hindus and Muslims, these being the two largest religions in India. Now, just to just to give you a different angle, okay? And I want to be very careful that we don't immediately assume that when we speak about communalism, we have to speak about Islam necessarily or Hinduism necessarily, by which I mean that there is a separate narrative. I've given you very small segments of that narrative, a separate narrative that we need to look at briefly before we return again to the partition of Bengal and to the political narrative. And what we need to look at very briefly is what is the position and situation of Muslims in India, okay, in the late 19th century moving into the 20th century. So recall 1858, the rebellion is crushed. The British take the view that the Muslims are more responsible for this than for the Hindus. And as I mentioned to you in a previous lecture, one of the consequences of that point of view is that they are going to mete out punishment to the Muslims, right? In greater measure than they will to the Hindus. And part of the Muslim response is to become insular, to withdraw within themselves. Now there are Muslim leaders, one of whom I think ought to be mentioned, and we need to look very, very briefly at some of his arguments, is Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. Okay, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is what you might describe as a Muslim modernist. Okay, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he's an important political figure. We're talking about the last quarter of the 19th century. He's going to set up a college in Aligarh. Aligarh is a large town, a small city, not that far from Delhi, a couple of hours from Delhi, really, a few hours from Delhi. And Aligarh is going to become the site of a major university eventually, which is called the Aligarh Muslim University, right? So there's this whole Aligarh school, as it's known. And Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is going to be the person who's going to argue that what the Muslims need to do in order to come out of their shell is they need to embrace Western education with a vengeance, right? He's obviously concerned about maintaining Muslim values, that Muslim students should know their own past, so forth and so on. He's also worried about the possibilities of a Hindu ascendancy once nationalism becomes important. Okay, so he is going to play an important role in, as I said, in propagating Western-style education among Muslims. Some people are inclined to see him as a loyalist, that is, loyalist to the British, that he's too loyal to the British, right? But he is an important figure in the last quarter of the 19th century. Now, as we move into the 20th century, think about what's happening. Let's go back to the Ganpati festival. Some Muslims might be alarmed by what's happening here, right? The masses are entering into politics, but one of the things that Tilak has done is he has taken a festival such as a Ganpati festival. Ganesh is a Hindu god, right? And so, of course, some people are alarmed. Some Muslims in particular might be alarmed by what they might consider to be a kind of Hindu turn to nationalism. That it is under the auspices of what you might describe as Hinduism, broadly speaking, that mass politics is now becoming important. And Shivaji himself, right, this 17th century Maratha guerrilla fighter, the person who really is going to be an irritant for the Mughal Empire, right? Shivaji himself is going to be revived as a preeminently Hindu figure. So there is obviously going to be some concern on the part of Muslims. Right? This is what we're talking about when we move into the early part of the 20th century. Okay? Now let's go back to the partition. So what is the consequence of the partition? The partition takes place by 1905, when the partition of Bengal is announced. You already have a substantial middle class elite in Bengal. Okay? And this partition is going to become the occasion for a mass movement. Again, it's not pan-Indian. So when I use the word mass, let us be very clear. I'm identifying three phases here. One is what Tilak is doing in Western India with the Ganpati festival and the revival of Shivaji, the figure of Shivaji. Okay. The second is now the response to the partition. What is the response? The Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi means one's own, a movement of self-reliance. So among other things, the leaders of the Swadeshi movement are going to call for a boycott of British goods, British textiles. You create a bonfire. You take all of these shirts and trousers that have been produced in Manchester or Lancashire, right? You ask people to surrender their Western style clothes, and then you create a huge bonfire out of it. Okay? You withdraw from British schools. Right? These are some of the things that are going to happen under the Swadeshi movement, where people are going to take to the streets. Right? And they're going to take to the streets because they're going to suggest that the partition is an attempt to divide the Bengali nation, to set one Bengali against another. Right? And of course, some Muslims are going to support the partition, because when there is a demand to revoke the partition, the Swadeshi movement is saying the partition needs to be undone. Okay? But there's going to be some Muslims who are certainly going to take the view that, well, if we have a separate province called Eastern Bengal and Assam, perhaps the interests of Muslims are going to be better served in a province where the population is predominantly Muslim. Nobody is suggesting, by the way, at this point in time, that all Muslims are supporting the idea of the partition. Right? But certainly there is greater support for the partition among Muslims than there is going to be among the Hindus. So the three phases then of the mass politics are going to be Western India, Tilak. Second, the Swadeshi movement. But again, the Swadeshi movement in this case now is confined to Eastern India. This is not a pan-Indian movement. And the third phase is when a new notion of the mass is going to emerge with the coming of Gandhi into the political scene, where when we speak of mass politics, we're speaking about a pan-Indian politics, right? Where the entirety of the nation, so to speak, is going to be involved, right? But we have to wait a bit before we get to that stage. So the Swadeshi movement eventually is going to lead to a decision by the British to revoke the partition. So in 1911, there is going to be what is called an imperial darbar. Okay, so the word darbar here is important. An imperial darbar. This is the first time, by the way, that a British monarch, a reigning British monarch, is actually going to come to India. Victoria, for example, never came to India, although Victoria was Empress of India. This was added to her official title in 1877. Okay, but Victoria never came to India. She had her favorite servant back in Britain was an Indian. She had a whole retinue of servants, of course, and there were Indians who were close to her, but she herself never came to India. So 1911, the British are going to have an imperial darbar. A darbar is an assemblage, okay, a grand assemblage, where all the native princes, remember there are over 500 native states, each of them ruled by a prince, or as the British privately would say, each of them ruled by a little native despot, right? Okay? Now, all of these people are going to be invited to the imperial assemblage, and depending, of course, on who you were, because there's a pecking order, okay, among the native princes as well, right? So this is a really, really grand affair. And at this imperial assemblage, the British are going to announce that they have decided to revoke the partition of Bengal. They're going to put the province back together. They're also going to announce that they're going to build a new capital in India. Right? And that's interesting. We need to pause about that for a moment, because in 1911, if the British are going to say we are going to build a new capital in India, they clearly are not thinking about the possibility that their departure from India might be quite imminent. They're not reflecting. They are assuming that, you know, remember the old expression, the sun never sets on the British Empire. They're assuming that they're here to stay for good. Because to invest money in a new capital, the energy at this stage of the game suggests that they think that, well, British rule at this point is firm. The foundations are absolutely secure. Why are they going to build a new capital, and where are they going to build a new capital? It's going to be in Delhi. It's going to be in Delhi, so you go back to where the Mughals were. Okay, the imperial assemblage, by the way, the darbar itself, you know, it echoes the great Mughal assemblages. So in a way, it is an admission by the British that they are the successors of the Mughals, the rightful successors of the Mughals. Of course, they're going to exceed them in their splendor. And the building of New Delhi is not a minor affair. It is a grand affair. I mean, if anybody here has been to Delhi, you would know exactly what I mean, because what they're going to do is they're going to construct, right, at a place where there had been several capitals before, right? So there have been cities in, around Delhi for ages, as they say, right? Because even before the Mughals, you had the Delhi Sultanate, and even before that, you have had a political presence in Delhi for a very substantial period of time, right? And the reason why Delhi has to be picked is because it signifies to the world, it signifies to the Indians that we are the legitimate rulers of India. And it is an admission that to be considered a legitimate ruler of India, in the eyes of Indians, you have to be based in Delhi, right? You cannot be based in the outpost called Calcutta in eastern India. Right? So they are going to build this new capital. It's going to be something that takes place over 10 years. There are two principal architects involved in it. One of them is a man by the name of Sir Edward Lutyens, Lutyens. The other person is Sir Herbert Baker. Herbert Baker is going to have a whole career building, if I may put it this way, colonial capitals, because subsequently, for example, he's going to, well, I can't remember if it was subsequently or before, but he had been critical in the building of Pretoria in South Africa as well. So Lutyens and Baker are going to be the persons who are going to be given the task of constructing this new capital, and it's going to be in the 1920s that New Delhi is going to come into being. Okay, so this is what happens at the Imperial Darbar in 1911. Now, couple of things before we begin to look at the Congress and mass politics in a new vein. Okay, 1905 can anybody think about what happened in 1905? Just curious, if anybody can recall. Yes, Jesse? On a world scale. Yeah, absolutely. The victory of Japan over Russia in 1905. This is the incident that is going to fire the imagination of Indian nationalists. Right? You read the autobiography of Jawaharlal Nehru. You pick up almost any book written by an Indian nationalist around that time. This is going to fire their imagination, because this demonstrates the possibilities of the revival of Asia. An Asian power, right, which, as many of you know, had been largely in seclusion before the so-called opening up of Japan, right, the Meiji Restoration. Right? That Japan itself had been an isolated country for 200-300 years. Of course, when we say isolated, this is all a very provincial way of reading it, because from the point of view of the West, if you have not opened yourself up to the West, you're provincial, you're backward. Right? Well, maybe they opened themselves up to others, for example, hypothetically one could say. Right? But if you haven't opened yourself up to the West, then the idea is that, well, you're provincial. Right? But this is effectively what we're saying is that Japan is a rising Asian power at this point in time. Of course, in 1905, Japan has not conducted a brutal campaign in China or Korea or any of that, right? But it is an emerging Asian power. And that's what Indian nationalists, Tagore, for example, is somebody who's really looking. Rabindranath Tagore is an Indian poet who is going to have the honor of being the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. So this is a pivotal moment for many Indian nationalists, the victory of Japan over Russia in 1905. Now, in 1907, so recall, 1905, the partition of Bengal, the Swadeshi movement, the victory of Japan over Russia. Okay? Swadeshi movement, already you know that what this means is the entry of the masses in eastern India into politics, right? A mass popular uprising. So it's not simply some elites who are now disaffected with British rule. Obviously, it has consequences for the future of the Indian National Congress Party. The Indian National Congress, right? The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, largely, as I said, an association of educated lawyers and gentlemen, engaging in shop talk, you might say, petitioning, so forth and so on. It's going to get transformed. The British, of course, have complete contempt. There is a viceroy by the name of Dufferin, okay, Curzon's predecessor. And you can imagine his contempt for the Congress, because he uses the phrase, he says, the Congress is an organization of a microscopic minority. So he's saying, like, who the hell cares about the Congress? Right? If I wanted to put it in very casual, who cares about the Congress? What makes the Congress think that they actually speak for Indians? Right? For the Indian masses, for the Indian peasants, so forth and so on. However, the Swadeshi movement and what Tilak does in Western India puts a different light on this matter. Right? Because Tilak, of course, is a member of the Congress as well. Many people in Congress are now going to capitalize on this politics. And in 1907, the Congress is going to be split between the so-called moderates and extremists. Okay, I say so-called because I think, again, these are provisional terms. You should think of them as provisional terms. What the distinction means very simply is that the moderates are willing to work within the framework of the British government of India, right? So, continue with the petitioning a bit. It's gone beyond the petitioning now by this point in time. By 1907, things have gone beyond the petitioning, no matter which camp you belong to. But you work within the legislative councils because, the British do have a infrastructure. And there is such a thing as the executive branch of government, the judicial branch of government, and the legislative branch of government. There are these legislative councils. Right? So the idea is you work to some extent within the framework of the British government of India. Right? What the extremists want to do is they want to go well beyond that. They want to go well beyond what you might describe as a constitutional framework. So when I say go beyond the constitutional framework, to be extra constitutional would mean, for instance, to take to the streets. To take to the streets. Right? It would mean for a political leader to say, I'm going to go on a hunger strike until such and such objective is met. Right? So forth and so on. So this is going to be the split between the moderates and the extremists. Tilak, of course, is viewed as an extremist, but remember that it's just around this time that Tilak himself is going to be put on trial for the second time, and he's going to be convicted and he's going to be sent off, right, to Mandalay. So what you have is a kind of a stalemate, if I may put it this way, in Indian politics at this time. The leaders of the extremists have been largely incapacitated. Okay, they're also, by the way, another group of people. Sometimes the British are going to lump them with the extremists. They're going to be called the terrorists, right? And who are the terrorists? The terrorists are essentially those Indians who say any means necessary to evict the British from India can be accepted by us, will be accepted by us, right? By all means necessary, to use Malcolm X's, famous expression. All right, that if this means that we have to resort to political assassination. So a very famous instance of that is the assassination of Rand, R-A-N-D, in 1897. Who is Rand? He's a British official, high-ranking British official. What's happening in 1897? You have a plague epidemic. Okay. And as a little footnote, let me add that the population of India, 1890 going into 1900, 1910, is going to be virtually stagnant because you have an astronomical number of people who are going to be killed on account of famines, the plague, okay, bubonic plague. Now, when you have a plague, I cannot give you a full-blown account, but just to give you a little illustration of some of the complexities that arise. When a plague, okay, starts ripping through a place, the British, of course, say that, well, we have a responsibility. We have to take certain safety precautions, okay, certain measures to improve health, sanitation, right? Minimize the number of deaths. So what they want to do is they want to go from house to house. They want to go from house to house, right? Find out, if somebody in that family is affected, because if they are, what do you do? You isolate them, right? You isolate them. But if you go from house to house, you are entering into a private home. And I don't want you to think simply of privacy in the ordinary sense of the term, right? This is an invasion of the only space that Indians have for themselves, so to speak, right? This is a realm which is preeminently their own. And in very conservative, very orthodox households, some of the women would have been in parda, right? And now you might have a plague inspector and his team suddenly barge into an Indian home, right? And so, of course, this is a very delicate matter. So, Rand is a plague inspector. And and some of these extremists or terrorists, as they're called, they see him as having violated certain kinds of norms. So he's going to be targeted for assassination in 1897. So this kind of political action is what the British are going to describe, obviously, as a form of terrorism. And there are going to be other forms of terrorism too. One of them is to disrupt railway communications. If you look at one of the maps I have, which I think I neglected to show you today, also from 1909, when the British did a whole series of maps, is a railway map of India. Because in 1909, the entire country is now crisscrossed by railways. So what the extremists are going to do is they're going to target the signs of British power. The telegraph office, you cut the telegraph line. You disrupt the railway network, right? Sabotage the railway tracks. And, of course, political assassinations, right? So this is a situation that we're talking about roughly 1905 leading into the second decade of the 20th century, okay? Now, in 1909, before we come to Gandhi, okay, so just before we come to Gandhi, in 1909, the British, remember that they have not revoked the partition of India yet, but they have seen that there is a mass politics now, okay? So that's one consideration, keep in mind, okay? Mass politics, what the British see there, what their assessment is of the changing situation in India. Second thing to keep in mind in order to understand something significant that's going to happen in 1909, the second significant thing is that the British now have to begin to think, how do we neutralize the nationalists? Right? Because they can see that this is now becoming a potent force. True, it has not swept the whole country yet, but what is there to say that it might not do so very soon? Right? So you want to try to neutralize nationalism, and you use, of course, one of the favorite strategies. And here again, it's a cliche, but cliches sometimes have their uses. Divide and rule. Right? You set one Indian against another if you can. 1907, without getting into the details, we know enough about it if you're a historian of India, certainly, to know that this is exactly what happened. What the British are going to do is they are going to encourage privately, secretly, Muslim elites to come up with a new political party which is going to represent only the Muslims. They're going to try to persuade the Muslims, hey, the Indian National Congress is becoming a major political force in India. But how do you know, they're going to tell the Muslim elites, how do you know that it is not going to become a vehicle of Hindu supremacy? Are your interests, are the interests of your co-religionists, fellow Muslims, going to be represented by the Indian National Congress? Do you wish to go back to the days when the Hindus were dominant? Right? I'm putting it in dramatic terms, but effectively that's what they're going to say to the Muslim elites. And in 1907, the Muslim League is going to be founded. The Muslim League, which is an organization, okay, intended to represent the political, social, and economic interests of the Muslims. And what we are saying is that there is absolutely incontrovertible evidence that this Muslim League is in fact set up with the active encouragement of the British. And this itself is an aspect of communalism. There's just no other way really to look at it. Okay? So 1909, the British are going to pass what are called the Morley-Minto reforms. You don't need to worry about these two characters. They're both part of the dustbin of history, frankly, except for for the fact that these reforms are named after them. One of them is a Viceroy of India, the other is a Secretary of State for India. I mean, they're both the two most important officials. Neither of them really is of any consequence today, from the point of view of trying to understand who was really shaping Indian history. But the Morley-Minto reforms, what do they intend to do? What they intend to do is to give a little breathing room to the Indians. A little breathing room to the Indians. Okay, so we are going to try to see if we can, have more participation in you in the legislative councils. We're going to be more attentive to your needs. We're going to try to set up more educational establishments which would, educate Hindus, Muslims, Indians, so forth and so on. That's what the Morley-Minto reforms should be viewed as really in 1909. Okay, but what they're also going to do, the British, is, and this again feeds into the history of communalism, they are going to have reserved seats for Muslims. What does reserved seats mean? Very briefly, affirmative action. I'm translating it into American terms, right? Quotas. So if you have 100, let's say there are 100 openings at the UCLA Medical School, okay, for admission. Reserved seats means you say 10% of the seats have to be reserved for Muslims. Okay? That's what reserved seats means, effectively. Okay? Particularly in political representation. And they're going to create separate electorates for Muslims. Okay? Separate electorates for Muslims, which means that only Muslims may vote in certain constituencies. And the only candidates there will be Muslims. Okay? Separate electorates, because of course in a democracy, right? I mean, so such as the electoral kind of electoral democracy you have, for example, in the United States today, or in India, right? Or in most other countries, generally you vote for, you have a slew of candidates, usually you have let's say 3, 4, 5, 6 candidates, and you vote for whichever candidate you think best represents your interests. But separate electorates are only Muslim candidates will be voting for, only Muslim voters will be voting for Muslim candidates. Okay? And the whole idea is that you want to be sure that, let's say there's a Muslim candidate who frankly doesn't think religion is much of an issue. Right? So the idea is that this person would be eliminated by the Muslim voter. All right? So what we're saying is that there are going to be institutional measures that are going to be undertaken by the British, which are going to give communalism a huge role in Indian political and public life. All right? So this then is the situation in the second decade. Right? The partition of Bengal has been revoked. A new capital has been announced in New Delhi. Certain measures have been taken which clearly indicate that the British are now going to certainly use the religious divide, right, to aggravate relations between Hindus and Muslims and to strengthen their own position. Fourthly, the advent of a mass politics, both in Western India and in Eastern India, does not have nationwide dimensions at this point in time. And fifthly, what you have is a split within the Congress, a political kind of stalemate, which is now going to create the room for the entry of Gandhi. But before that happens, what you have is World War I. Before that happens, right? And so I just want to take 2 minutes to wrap up my discussion of World War I and set the stage up for the entry of Gandhi into Indian politics. So I've already indicated to you that 1914 to 1918, 1.2 million, the numbers vary. Some people say 1, some say 1.4. I'm taking a middle figure. 1.4 million, 1.2 million Indians fought, not just in India, or rather on the Indian frontier, I should say, not just on the Indian frontier in places like Burma and so on, but in North Africa, okay, in modern day Iraq, in the Low Countries, in France, Belgium, all right, in East Africa. Right? In East Africa, you know that Germany by this point was a power in East, so you have Germany, East Africa. That's one of the reasons why there's fighting at that front. Okay? And as I said, 70,000 Indians are going to lose their lives. Now, of course, Indians had an expectation that in view of the enormous sacrifice that they had made on behalf of the British Empire, right? The sacrifice being both in terms of lives, manpower, the number of people who had fought, and in terms of what they had contributed to the war effort with respect to things like material goods. Indians had an expectation, which I would argue is a reasonable expectation, that they would be suitably rewarded for their services to the empire. In 1917, the Secretary of State for India, the then Secretary of State for India, a man by the name of Montagu, makes an announcement. The announcement is that it is the declared policy of His Majesty's government, that is the British government, it is a declared policy of His Majesty's government to increase the ability of Indians to take part in self-governance. Okay? In other words, that what he is suggesting is that some kind of limited self-government, a bit more along the lines of what Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the white colonies had, can be envisioned in the near future. That's a proclamation that he makes in 1917, Montagu, right? That Indians can look forward to a greater role in the affairs of their own country, particularly with respect to political participation, and particularly with respect to participation at the higher levels of the government. But what's going to happen is that during the war, of course, the British are going to impose draconian measures. For example, censorship. Okay? And rather than lifting all of these measures, at the end of the war, a new regime of repression is going to be unleashed on Indians. Okay? At the end of the war, in 1918, the Defense of India regulations, which had been imposed during the war, Defense of India regulations, put enormous restrictions on what people can do during wartime. Many countries do that during wartime. They impose certain kinds of restrictions. Okay? So these Defense of India regulations are not going to be lifted at the end of the war. In fact, there are going to be a strict set of rules that are going to be imposed because, of course, now the British are thinking, now that the war is over, we can turn our attention full-time to the question of how to subdue Indian nationalism. Right? And this is obviously going to create a reaction among the Indians and is going to now set up the stage for the entry of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. So that's going to be the subject of my lecture on Tuesday. I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving.